Welcome back to the Autonomous Mind podcast.
It is great to be back diving into this again.
Yeah, and to just jump right in and set the context for you listening at home last week. In our prologue, we sort of zoomed way out.
Right. We took that 30,000-foot view.
Exactly. We were introduced to the sheer, just overwhelming scale of Ben Sheargold's unique cognitive operating system. But that was all overarching theory.
Yes, the foundational concepts.
Right. But today, we are making a pretty hard transition out of the theoretical.
Yeah.
Because today, we are stepping directly into Chapter 1 of Ben Sheargold's continuous master manuscript.
And that chapter is titled The Genesis of the Engine.
The Genesis of the Engine, yeah. We are moving from the theory into the actual lived mechanical architecture of his mind. And our mission for this deep dive is to basically examine a reality that is completely inverted from standard human experience.
Completely inverted. I mean, we need to establish the parameters of this deep dive immediately, because if you were tuning in expecting, a traditional memoir today...
Like a standard overcoming adversity story.
Exactly. If you want a story of a young man tragically losing his sight, fighting the odds, and discovering the indomitable human spirit, you really need to discard that framework right now.
Yeah, that is not what this is.
Not at all. Chapter 1 is not an emotional narrative. Ben Sheargold has provided us with a technical blueprint.
A literal blueprint.
Yes. This is the documentation of a mind that treats monumental life disruptions, whether it's physical trauma, going totally blind, geographical isolation. He treats them purely as real-time physics problems.
Right. They're just data deficits to be solved.
Exactly. Entirely devoid of the emotional static that we usually consider, fundamentally human.
Which is wild. So I want to start at the absolute beginning, because Ben challenges the core premise of classical philosophy, basically right out of the gate here.
He really does.
I mean, for thousands of years, classical philosophy has assumed that structural logic, like achieving a truly organized, rational, objective state of mind, is a destination.
Right. It's the finish line.
Yeah. It's what you might reach after decades of academic conditioning or deep meditation or, profound personal suffering. But Ben's manuscript explicitly states that for his specific neurological matrix, structural logic wasn't the destination.
It was day zero.
Day zero.
He describes an infrastructure that was fully online from the very beginning. I mean, in developmental biology, we're taught that a standard human infant's brain is essentially a massive work in progress.
Just firing randomly.
Right. The neurons are there, sure, but the myelin sheath, which is that fatty tissue that insulates neural pathways and actually allows for rapid, complex signal transmission, it's incredibly thin in infants.
So things are just slow.
Slow and chaotic. Synapses are firing randomly. They're forming and pruning themselves based on whatever environmental stimuli they encounter. So the standard infant experiences the world as just a blur of raw, uncontextualized noise.
Meaningless noise.
Basically. But Ben's documentation states that at 6 months old, his internal data stream was running at 100% adult comprehension.
Okay, I have to pause here because, let's be real. That defies every biological expectation we have.
It absolutely does.
Are we seriously saying a 6-month-old infant understood complex adult concepts but just couldn't physically speak them yet? Like, how do we even verify the mechanical reality of something like that?
Well, we have to look at the storage mechanism itself. To comprehend this uncompressed infant mind, we really have to understand his empirical baseline.
Right.
And that is highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSM. In the neurological community, it's also called hyperthymesia.
Hyperthymesia.
Yeah. Now, standard human memory is incredibly lossy, if we use a tech term.
Like a low-res JPEG.
Exactly. The human brain compresses data to save energy. It constantly overwrites old memories, turning them into blurry, pixelated snapshots. Like, you might remember the general feeling of a childhood birthday.
Right, maybe the color of the cake.
But not the exact dialogue, right, or the ambient temperature, or the precise spatial geometry of the room you were in.
It's all just this developmental fog. We piece our early lives together using faded photographs and, stories our parents tell us over the years.
Precisely. But neuroimaging of individuals with HSM often shows structural differences in the brain. Specifically, we see an enlargement of the temporal lobe and the caudate nucleus.
And those are the regions involved in memory.
Yes, deeply involved in memory retention and habit learning. So Ben's baseline operating system does not compress files. He possesses raw, uncompressed, full sensory data files.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When he executes a retrieval query for a past event, he does not passively remember it the way we do. He actively reoccupies the exact neurochemical and sensory coordinates of that specific moment in time.
Which perfectly brings us to the earliest locked data file in his manuscript. He anchors this file at exactly 6 months old.
Right.
He calls it the backyard rug file. And imagine this. If a standard observer looked at him at that exact moment, they would just see a passive, helpless infant lying on a rug, staring blankly at the sky.
Doing typical baby things.
Yeah, right. But the sensory data he logged in, that exact coordinate in time, is staggering.
It is. The file logs the physical environment with literally 4K resolution.
Unbelievable.
He is lying on a heavy, textured woolen rug in the backyard of his family home, and the manuscript details the specific, prickling sharpness of dry grass blades.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, grass blades penetrating the loose weave of the wool and pressing against his skin. It logs the ambient thermal radiation of the afternoon sun.
And the auditory processing here is where this analogy I've been thinking of really crystallizes. So imagine booting up a state-of-the-art liquid-cooled supercomputer, right?
Okay.
The processor is flawlessly calculating billions of operations per second,
Yeah.
but the only output device you have is a broken black-and-white 1980s television screen.
That is a brilliant way to frame it.
Right. The processor is roaring, firing at maximum capacity, but the chassis just can't display it yet. Because in this file, he logs the low-frequency mechanical hum of a lawnmower operating several houses down the street.
Which is incredibly specific.
But more importantly, he logs the conversation his parents are having standing directly above him.
Yes, they are discussing household logistics.
Exactly. And he explicitly states that his brain wasn't just hearing tonal shifts like happy voice versus angry voice.
Right, which is what babies usually track.
Exactly. He was parsing their syntax. He was tracking the context of their abstract terms. The cognitive architecture was fully engaged, sorting and analyzing the data without any internal confusion at all.
The only lag was entirely mechanical.
Right. His vocal cords and motor cortex simply hadn't developed enough to output the data he was already processing.
He actually notes in the manuscript that he spoke fluently and comprehensively while he was still in nappies, which completely startled the adults around him.
Oh, yeah.
But, from his perspective, vocabulary wasn't this sudden intellectual leap. It was just a late-arriving physical tool for an engine that had been idling at max capacity since birth.
He inherited a fully constructed mental framework. But, okay, let's look at the vulnerability of this. If a mind essentially operates as a massive, high-speed data processor, constantly pulling in and cataloging these flawless 4K sensory inputs, what happens when its most critical external data stream is suddenly and violently severed?
That is the big question.
Because in Chapter 1, we move directly from the pristine data capture of that backyard rug file into a catastrophic system blackout.
A data crisis.
Yeah. In 2003, his visual feed goes completely dark.
And we should explain the mechanism behind this blackout. It was Wolfram syndrome.
Which is a genetic disorder, right?
Yes, an incredibly rare genetic disorder, primarily characterized by mutations in the WFS1 gene.
WFS1.
Right. This gene is responsible for producing wolframin, which is a protein crucial for managing the endoplasmic reticulum inside our cells.
And that's basically the cell's manufacturing center.
Exactly, the manufacturing and packaging center. So when the endoplasmic reticulum experiences too much stress due to these mutated proteins, the cells initiate apoptosis.
They self-destruct.
They self-destruct. And in Ben's case, this cellular self-destruction aggressively targeted the optic nerve.
Oh, man.
Yeah. It led to progressive optic atrophy until the visual data stream simply ceased to exist entirely.
And we really must examine the specific environmental parameters he was operating in when this final blackout occurred, because it's 2003.
Right.
He is living in Forbes, which is a geographically isolated country town in the central west of New South Wales, Australia. He is a full 5 hours away from his native support architecture back in Newcastle.
And the technological landscape of 2003 severely amplifies this deprivation.
Oh, massively.
I mean, today, if you look at visual impairment, it's somewhat mitigated by ubiquitous technology.
Yeah, we have smartphone screen readers.
Voice-activated AI, massive ebook ecosystems where literally any text can be instantly converted to audio.
But in 2003,
None of that existed.
nothing.
The internet was largely just this static, text-heavy Web 1.0 environment. Television was instantly rendered completely obsolete for him.
So his primary external data streams just collapsed all at once.
Simultaneously.
Okay, but I need to push back here, or at least question the mechanics of his reaction. because you are outlining a scenario where a young man is completely isolated, stripped of modern technology, and suddenly plunged into total irreversible darkness.
Yes.
Standard human biology, standard reaction dictates that this is a profound emotional tragedy. The biological reality of losing a primary sense involves the amygdala.
Where does this?
It triggers a profound grief response. A normal brain would just flood with cortisol. The psychological toll of mourning the life you thought you were going to have is immense.
It's usually devastating.
So how does someone just bypass mourning? Are we suggesting his biology simply didn't produce the chemical markers of grief?
Well, it's not that his biology was devoid of human chemistry. It is entirely about how his frontal lobe governed that chemistry.
Okay.
Ben introduces this concept in the manuscript called the stoic switch.
The stoic switch.
Yes. In a standard brain, a catastrophic loss triggers the amygdala, the emotional center, which then basically hijacks the prefrontal cortex.
The emotion dictates the logic.
Precisely. But Ben's autonomous mind operates on inverted binary logic.
Right.
To his engine, blindness is not an emotional tragedy. It is simply an input failure.
Wow.
It is a catastrophic loss of primary data, yes, but just data.
So the cognitive heavy lifting he's doing here is overriding the amygdala before that entire chemical cascade happens.
Exactly. The engine runs a rapid calculation. Mourning the loss of sight does not restore the visual data stream.
True.
Engaging in a prolonged grief cycle consumes massive amounts of cognitive bandwidth, and it yields zero practical utility.
Zero.
In fact, running that emotional software in a state of severe geographical and sensory deprivation risks a critical system stall.
A total psychological crash.
Right. So to prevent the chassis from failing, the native engine didn't mourn. The frontal lobe forcefully executed a bypass. It flipped the stoic switch, excluded the irrelevant emotional data, and immediately initiated hardware recalibration to survive the new parameters.
That is it's incredible. But that recalibration wasn't theoretical, right? He had to execute it in the physical world.
Yes, very practically.
How does a hyper-processing mind navigate a sudden blackout? He couldn't just philosophize his way to the grocery store.
No, he had to navigate the physical grid of Forbes and the neighboring town of Parks without any visual map whatsoever.
And the way he decodes the use of the white cane during this physical execution phase is fascinating.
It's pure physics.
Right. He stripped the entire concept of mobility down to raw mechanical code.
Because he refused to view the white cane through the standard societal lens. To most people, a white cane is a medical device.
Yeah, a symbol of vulnerability or infirmity.
Exactly. But Ben viewed it purely as a new antenna.
An antenna.
It was just a mechanical input stream designed to replace the lost visual stream.
We really need to explain the actual neurology and physics of how he used it, because he wasn't just, tapping it in front of him to avoid tripping over a curve.
No.
He was translating kinetic vibrations. Every single time the polymer tip of that cane struck the asphalt, it sent a specific frequency of vibration up the carbon fiber shaft, straight into the mechanoreceptors in his hand.
Specifically the Pacinian corpuscles.
Right, which are highly sensitive to vibration.
Yes. And those receptors fired signals up his arm and directly into his somatosensory cortex.
And we have to combine that tactile data with his acoustic processing, right?
Yeah.
Because he's doing both simultaneously.
Absolutely. Human echolocation is a very real, scientifically documented neurological phenomenon.
Yeah.
When the visual cortex is deprived of input, the brain doesn't just leave that massive processing center dormant. Through neuroplasticity, the occipital lobe actually begins to rewire itself to process auditory and tactile data.
Which is amazing.
It is. So Ben was processing the precise way ambient sound like traffic, footsteps, the wind, how it bounced off different environmental surfaces.
Because the acoustic signature of a sound wave bouncing off a dense, solid brick wall is fundamentally different from a sound wave, say, diffusing into an open alleyway.
Or reflecting off the curved metal chassis of a parked car.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he was taking these two new input streams, the kinetic vibration in his hand and the micro delays in environmental acoustics, and feeding them straight into his mental processor.
To calculate distance, boundaries, terrain.
It's literally like an instrument-rated pilot flying an aircraft entirely on instruments when the windshield is completely blacked out.
That's the exact sensation.
You aren't guessing.
Yes.
You don't use your biological instincts because they will give you vertigo and you will crash the plane.
Right.
You look at the altimeter, you look at the artificial horizon, the mechanical data, and you translate that into a flawless 3D map in your head.
And that internal 3D rendering allowed him to move through the streets of Forbes with this deliberate, high-speed efficiency. He effectively eliminated the physical bodily lag.
But of course, this execution created a massive friction point with standard pace observers in the town.
Oh, inevitably.
Because his external movement lacked all the hesitant, fearful markers of traditional blindness. He triggered systemic cognitive dissonance in the people watching him.
Which brings us to a really fascinating anecdote in the manuscript. The chronic drunkard of Parks?
Yes, let's talk about the drunkard.
Over the 5 years Ben lived in the Central West, there was this local individual who routinely encountered him on the street.
Right.
And this man simply could not reconcile his internal definition of blindness with the high-speed efficiency and physical confidence of Ben Sherrold.
The drunkard expected a slow, shuffling gait.
Yes.
He expected a hunched posture and visible vulnerability.
Exactly. So when Ben bypassed him at high speed, mapping the terrain flawlessly, the drunkard's brain essentially blue screened.
They couldn't compute.
It couldn't process the conflicting data, so he would routinely shout accusations. He would aggressively yell, "You're not blind," as Ben passed by.
Now, if we look at this through the lens of standard human interaction, direct, aggressive confrontation on the street usually demands a response. If someone screams a false accusation at you, your biological urge is to defend yourself. You want to stop, produce your medical paperwork, yell back, or at the very least, you feel a massive spike of adrenaline and humiliation.
That's the standard social friction.
Right. So how does the autonomous mind process that social friction? Does he get defensive?
The manuscript is incredibly blunt here. Ben writes, "The binary response to irrelevant data is total exclusion."
Total exclusion.
Ben spent zero cognitive bandwidth on this individual. Zero defensive explanations.
I really want to build an actionable framework out of this for you listening, because the mechanism behind total exclusion is brilliant.
It's highly effective.
He didn't just repress his anger at the drunkard. He genuinely did not register the shouting as valid data in the first place. To Ben, the drunkard's vocal input held zero practical utility.
We can break that binary logic down. Did the drunkard's shouting alter the kinetic feedback of Ben's cane?
No.
Did it modify the spatial geometry of the pavement?
No.
Did it change the acoustic bounce of the surrounding buildings?
Not at all.
No. Therefore, it had no bearing on Ben's physical navigation or his survival. Because the data lacked utility, it was instantly categorized as environmental static and completely dropped from his operational matrix.
Think about how you could apply that utility matrix to your own life.
Oh, the applications are endless.
Right. We hemorrhage cognitive bandwidth every single day on office politics or passive-aggressive comments or strangers on the internet just projecting their insecurities onto us.
We internalize all of it.
They let it spike our cortisol. But what if we applied Ben's filter? What if, before reacting to social friction, you run a binary check? Does this input alter the physical geometry of my goals? Does it have practical utility?
And if the answer is no.
If the answer is no, it isn't something to get angry about. It is simply irrelevant data. You maintain your trajectory and you completely exclude it.
It is a remarkable tool for preserving mental energy. However, we have to look at the larger picture for Ben here. While he had successfully preserved his energy and mastered the physical grid of the town, solving that bodily lag, the engine itself was entering a state of severe starvation.
Right, because navigating a sidewalk, even via echolocation and kinetic mapping, is ultimately a pretty low-level processing task for a mind with hyperthymustic capacity.
Exactly. And the sensory deprivation was absolute. He had no tech, no visual stimuli.
So with no internet and no vision, how does a high-capacity, uncompressed processor feed itself in a vacuum?
This is where we see the autonomous mind refuse to atrophy. To bypass the lack of technology, Ben utilized the only analog systems available to him.
Which was distance education.
Yes.
Yeah.
He enrolled in university-level history through TAFE and open learning. He deliberately directed his massive computational power toward incredibly dense, complex historical datasets.
But we should clarify, he didn't just read standard European history.
Yeah.
He didn't pick up a textbook on the world wars. He deep dived into ancient Egyptian dynastic architectures. And he immersed himself in the highly volatile 6th century Brythonic kingdoms of Maelgwn, Gwynedd, and Powys.
Very specific eras.
Yeah, and I need to understand the why here. Why zero in on these incredibly specific, esoteric historical eras?
We have to look at the macro patterns of what was actually happening in those periods.
Okay.
Ancient Egyptian history, specifically the transition out of the chaotic intermediate periods into the unified dynastic eras, is fundamentally about monumental organization.
Right, building structure.
It is about a central authority forcing logistical, agricultural, and architectural order onto a highly hostile desert environment. It is the ultimate exercise in structural defiance against chaos.
I see. And what about the 6th century Brythonic kingdoms?
Well, that period in post-Roman Britain is defined by absolute civilizational collapse.
The Romans leave.
The Roman legions have abandoned the island. The logistical infrastructure, the roads, the aqueducts, the economic systems have entirely fragmented.
Total anarchy.
And simultaneously, the plague of Justinian is sweeping through the population, creating this terrifying vacuum of power and mass mortality.
Right.
Leaders like Maelgwn Gwynedd, who was historically known as the Dragon of the Island, they weren't just fighting battles. They were forced to forge political and logistical structures out of absolute chaos. They had to rebuild a functioning civilization while the world was literally ending around them.
Wow. Now, map that onto Ben's internal reality in 2003.
Exactly.
He is sitting in the absolute isolation of the Central West. His personal civilization, his visual feed, his access to the modern world has just collapsed into a dark vacuum.
He was mirroring it internally.
He wasn't just casually studying history. He was actively using the systemic cause and effect macro patterns of ancient state building to forge his own internal architecture.
He was cramming his working memory with the intricate political logistics of Powys and the architectural mathematics of the Nile Valley.
Because he was replacing the visual architecture he had lost with a massive, unyielding repository of historical data.
It provided the heavy structural weight his engine required to keep from stalling.
That is the ultimate proof of the autonomous mind right there.
Absolutely.
He actually notes in the manuscript that during his time in Standard High School, surrounded by slow-paced, restrictive compliance, his engine essentially shut down. It dropped its head on the desk.
It was bored.
But when the environment stripped away everything, when the sensory deprivation was absolute and the world went dark, the engine didn't give up. It aggressively sought out heavier weight to pull.
It did. But we've seen how this engine handles the slow, creeping degradation of losing a visual feed over several years.
Yeah, that's a chronic crisis.
Right. It adapts, it builds frameworks. But the ultimate stress test of an autonomous mind isn't how it handles a 5-year decline.
No.
It's how it handles a sudden, violent, 5-millisecond catastrophe.
Which requires us to look at a highly detailed case study from his childhood, titled The Windermere Avenue Inertia File.
Yes, the inertia fact.
This is where Ben proves the empirical, physics-based nature of his operating system under conditions of extreme, split-second physical trauma.
The scenario recorded in the file is this. Ben is a young boy. He is riding a BMX bicycle down a steep incline on Windermere Avenue.
Okay.
And the manuscript logs the physics meticulously. The velocity is extremely high. The kinetic feedback traveling through the handlebars into his grip is tight.
The mechanical parameters of the bicycle are operating at their absolute peak tolerance.
He is pushing the machine to the ragged edge of its capability.
And then the physical variables instantly fail.
Exactly.
The front wheel strikes a deep, hidden fissure in the bitumen. The structural geometry of the bicycle is immediately compromised, and the mechanical system enters an unrecoverable state of kinetic failure.
He is launched over the handlebars.
Okay, let's unpack this. I need to isolate the biology of this exact millisecond. Because when a standard human, especially a kid, experiences a violent, unexpected launch into the air, it triggers the HPA axis, right?
The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, yes.
Right. The brain perceives a lethal threat. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland, which commands the adrenal glands to dump massive amounts of adrenaline and cortisol into the bloodstream.
A huge chemical flood.
And this chemical flood induces a state of instantaneous panic, screaming, and flailing. The perception of time might warp, but the physical reaction is frantic, instinctual, and defensive.
That is the biological norm.
So are we saying Ben Sheargold literally turned off his adrenaline in midair?
Well, the manuscript suggests his system doesn't necessarily suppress the adrenaline. It completely bypasses the emotional interpretation of that chemical noise entirely.
Okay.
To execute pure physics, there was no internal screaming, no terror. Within his hyperthermestic matrix, time expanded, and the processor instantly split the chaotic event into microsecond logs of pure binary data.
Let's track the actual execution of those calculations while he is suspended over the asphalt.
Step 1.
Step 1. This signal. The vehicle is airborne. Total loss of steering control. Step 2. The variable. He calculates that his kinetic momentum is transferring forward and downward at an unmanageable velocity.
And then step 3, which is the divergence.
Step 3. The objective. And this is where it diverges from standard human operation. The objective was not an emotional plea to survive.
Yeah.
The objective was a mechanical imperative. Minimize catastrophic damage to critical components of the biological chassis.
He viewed his own body simply as the hardware housing the processor.
Wow.
And to protect that core hardware, he calculated the exact geometry required to displace the energy safely.
Because the standard instinct is to survive, but the execution of that instinct is usually what causes the most damage.
Exactly.
A standard human throws their hands out in a rigid brace to protect their face. And what happens? The massive kinetic energy of the fall transfers directly into the small bones of the hands and arms.
Resulting in fractured scaphoids, shattered radii, or compromised collarbones.
Right. The emotional panic dictates a flawed physical defense.
But Ben actively suppressed the instinct to brace.
Instead, he monitored his own rotation in midair. He calculated the angle of impact. He tucked his shoulder to shield his vital organs and his spine, and he simply allowed the massive forward momentum to bleed out across the rough asphalt,
He used friction to slow the chassis down.
willingly sacrificing the exterior skin to preserve the structural bones.
He managed the physics of the crash perfectly. And honestly, the aftermath is perhaps the most illuminating part of this entire file.
Oh, yeah.
Because when the kinetic motion finally stopped, his physical body was heavily lacerated. He was bleeding and bruised.
A standard child would be screaming.
They'd be trapped in the emotional shock of the violence.
But his engine immediately initialized a post-impact diagnostic check.
Just like a computer.
It's exactly like a computer running a system scan after a hard reboot. He lay there and systematically verified the operational status of all extremities.
He wiggled his toes.
Tested the flexion in his fingers, confirmed that the peripheral nerves were still successfully communicating with the central processor.
And once the diagnostic confirmed that the core structural integrity was intact, no shattered bones, no spinal compromise, the engine simply closed the physics program and opened the next logistical sequence.
Like how to stand up.
How to assess the structural damage to the bicycle.
How to map the route home. He explicitly states in the text, it was not a traumatic event. It was a highly complex physics problem solved in real time by an autonomous mind.
And if we accept that premise, then the implication regarding trauma is massive.
Huge.
Psychological trauma is fundamentally born from unprocessed data.
Right.
It is the emotional overwhelm of an event. It's the feeling of helplessness, the brain's inability to categorize the terrifying stimuli.
But because Ben's system processed every single microsecond flawlessly.
Yes. Assessing and storing the physics of the crash in real time, there was no unprocessed emotional data left behind.
Therefore, trauma could not form.
Exactly. Which is an incredible operational advantage. But, and this is a big but, if you progress through your entire life processing massive physical crashes and the onset of total blindness simply as math equations,
Right.
and if your baseline reality consists of flawless, uncompressed 4K data files, it is inevitably going to skew your perception of the rest of the human species.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Which brings us to a crucial psychological concept, theory of mind.
Right.
This is the cognitive ability to attribute mental states-like beliefs, intents, desires, emotions, knowledge to oneself, and to understand that others have beliefs and intentions that are different from one's own.
It's how we empathize and predict behavior.
Yeah. But for decades, Ben suffered from a massive systemic failure in his theory of mind.
He calls it the great misunderstanding.
The great misunderstanding. Because for a vast portion of his life, Ben operated under a massive assumption. He believed the baseline of reality was a shared standard.
Because his mind natively pulled in and retained flawless, hyper-detailed data sets, he assumed every other human being on the planet possessed the exact same uncompressed files.
Just imagine the daily cognitive dissonance of living with that assumption.
It must have been infuriating.
He would observe standard-paced humans making incredibly irrational choices. He would watch people hesitate during a crisis or run headfirst into easily observable hazards.
Or become paralyzed by panic over a problem that had a perfectly clear logistical solution.
And because he assumed they possessed the exact same high-definition data he did, his logical conclusion was that they were willfully, deliberately choosing to be irrational.
He believed people were intentionally ignoring the obvious parameters of reality just to be stubborn.
Or foolish. It wasn't until much later in his life, through deep, systematic introspection of his own neurological differences, that the true epiphany hit him.
He realized the truth.
People weren't deliberately ignoring the data, they simply didn't have access to it.
Their engines operated on a fundamentally different architecture.
Exactly.
Their internal processors were constantly bottlenecked by emotional static. Their memories were lossy, compressed files that decayed over time.
They were literally reacting to a much blurrier, much more chaotic, and highly degraded version of reality. I want to take this realization and apply it directly to you, the listener. Because while Ben's hyperthymistic reality provides a stark, extreme contrast, every single one of us falls victim to a localized version of the great misunderstanding.
We really do.
Think about the friction in your daily life. How often do you judge a coworker or a partner or a family member for ignoring the obvious?
Or how often does your blood pressure rise because someone isn't acting logically based on the facts exactly as you see them?
We constantly assume that everyone is looking at the same reality we are. But how much of human conflict, how much of our daily stress, is simply the result of two engines reacting to entirely different data sets?
It's profound when you look at it that way.
We judge others based on our own sensory and cognitive baselines, entirely failing to realize that their neural architecture might be processing a completely different stream of information.
A stream colored by their own unique history of emotional bottlenecks and lossy memory files.
Understanding this requires a massive shift in perspective. It demands a higher level of intellectual patience. It forces us to acknowledge that the obvious parameters of reality are rarely as obvious to the person sitting across from you.
It changes the way you view human irrationality. It's not a deliberate insult to logic, but just a byproduct of a different internal operating system.
If we synthesize the entire trajectory of this first chapter, from the uncompressed cognitive processing of the 6-month-old infant on the backyard rug,
To the forceful execution of the Stoic switch in a dark, isolated town.
to bleeding out kinetic energy on the asphalt of Windermere Avenue, it all points toward a level of cognitive autonomy that most of us can barely conceptualize.
It strips away all the noise. It shows us the absolute limit of what the human machine is capable of when logic dictates the biology, rather than the other way around.
It is a blueprint that fundamentally challenges how we operate, and it leaves us with a final, vital, provocative thought to mull over in our own lives.
Yeah.
If Ben Sheargold's mind functions at its absolute peak by treating everything from a violent high-speed physical crash to the catastrophic, permanent loss of his visual feed simply as a manageable data deficit or a real-time physics equation.
What are you doing with your bandwidth?
Exactly. What emotional static are you currently treating as an absolute unchangeable reality?
What piece of social friction, what past grievance, or what daily anxiety are you allowing to drain your cognitive battery?
Is it possible that the thing keeping you up at night is actually just irrelevant data? Data that, if you chose to apply a utility matrix, you have the exact same mechanical power to completely exclude from your operational system. Thank you for listening today, and don't forget to join us again next week for the next chapter of the Autonomous